Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. In this tutorial, I'll share a few different ways that you can use your dye ink pads for watercolor techniques. To start, you're going to need some kind of non-porous surface for a palette. I'm using a ceramic tile. These are really inexpensive and you can pick up individual tiles at any hardware store for less than $1. If you don't have a tile, you can use a piece of glass or plastic or your craft sheet or even something like a CD case or some plastic packaging. You're going to need dye inks, and I'm using Color Box Premium Dye Inks today. These pads are new to me, and I love that they have the foam pads instead of the felt and linen. I don't have anything else like these, and they're very reactive and super juicy and vibrant. To fill my palette, I'm just going to tap the edge of a few of the ink pads onto my tile. It's really just that easy. If you have dye re-inkers or markers, you can use those on your palette as well. You will need watercolor paper. And I'm using hot press paper today because it has a nice smooth surface for stamping, but whatever watercolor paper you have will work. And then this is the brush that I'm using. It's a number 8 round, and it's a Daler Rowney sapphire brush with synthetic sable bristles, and these do come with a lifetime guarantee. You'll do just fine if you don't have this brush, but someone always asks me what I'm using, so now you know. If this is a new technique to you, I really recommend just playing for a while to see how your inks react on the paper that you have. You'll want to experiment with different amounts of water and ink, with different brush strokes and with different types of blending. Just really take the time to play with the supplies you have and find out what works best for you. I started with just a medium amount of water on my brush, but here you can see that diluting the ink will give you a lighter color. And when I add water to the ink, I usually pull it away from my initial swatch. If you want a darker color, you'll want to blot your brush to get out some of the water and then pick up ink from an area of your palette that's not diluted. For adding shading, there are 2 different methods that I use. The first is a wet into wet technique, and for that I start with a diluted color and then I dot in more concentrated color where I want the shading as the paint dries, and I found that dotting technique to be the best for keeping the color in place. You can see here that when the paint is a little wetter, it will spread out a little more and lose some of the concentration, and the more it dries, the darker and more stationary the additional paint will remain. Another method I use is called glazing, and with this method, instead of leaving the paint wet, you allow it to dry before you add layers of shading, and you can use your heat tool to speed that drying process along. One tip for this, if you just pick up paint on the tip of your brush, the water in the body of the brush will give you kind of a natural blend when you use the brush on its side, so that will help blend that additional color into your original color. So take the time to practice these blending techniques too and decide which you like better for your style. I'm going to move on to a stamped image to show you how I use those methods on my cards. I'm starting on this sort of central peony here, and I'm going to use the wet into wet method first. And with this method, again, you start with a diluted layer of color and then dot in shading where you want the area to be darker. We do have a site tutorial on shading theory, but in general, you want to add shading to areas that are hidden behind something, areas that are lower on the image, and areas that appear farther away or are curving away. On a floral image like this one, the darkest areas are usually toward the center of the flower and the bottom of the flower. So at the bottom of each petal where it's connecting into the center, or in the little valley areas where the petals overlap, those are going to be darker. When you use the wet into wet method too, you're going to hop around your image a little bit. You don't want to work on 2 areas that are side by side, or the paint from one area is going to bleed into the other. I finished up the lighter layers there, and I wanted to add some darker shading with more control. So I've heat set this area, and I'm going to go in with a darker color and very little water in my brush, and just add in the deepest areas of shading to some of the lower and the more central petals. For the next flower, I'm going to mix that raspberry pink, which is my new favorite thing, and the blue ink to create a new color on my palette, an intermediate purple. So remember that you're not limited to the ink pad colors that you have. You can mix them right on your palette. And on this flower, instead of working on one petal at a time, I'm going to use the glazing method. So I'm filling in the entire base color at once, and I'll heat set that so the entire area is dry. And then I can go back in with a darker concentration of ink to add some shading. For the darker color, I have less water in my brush, and I also pulled a little more blue into the mix. One difference with the glazing method is that you can create layers, and since dye ink is transparent, you can still see the original layers as you go. Whereas with the wet into wet method, there is variation of color, but just a single layer. If you don't want hard lines on the edges of your layers, remember to keep your color on the tip of your brush, and then you can angle your brush to let the water in the brush blend out the edge of the color. And you can also use a clean brush to soften edges too. Dye ink will usually lift pretty easily, unlike some pigmented paints. On the next two flowers, I did a wet into wet technique, but I did fill in the entire flower to start with instead of doing individual petals, since these areas are sort of in the background. And then you'll see that I dotted more concentrated color around the bottom of each flower and into the center of the one that's tipped down. For the last flower, I used the raspberry pink again, but I used the glazing technique so I could balance some of the intensity of the shading on the first flower that I did, but I didn't have to focus so much on the detail. I did the leaves with the wet into wet technique, using the green for the base layer and then a little blue mixed in for the shading. I just used some loose strokes to fill in the background and the glass in my image, and I wanted to ground the image so it didn't look like it was floating. So I created a neutral blend by blending several of the colors on my palette together, and that created sort of a blue-gray, which works because all of the component colors are in the painting already. So if you do that and you come up with a muddy mess, it will probably be fine for this step. Here's my completed card. This stamp is from Stampers Anonymous. It's called Peonies and was illustrated by Catherine Scanlon, and the sentiment is from Verve. Before you wipe off your palette, remember that you can still use that ink to make a background. I misted my palette with water, and I used the backside of my practice paper from earlier to take a print. And in the photo tutorial, you'll find a link to the Wrinkle-Free Distress technique, and that's basically what I'm doing here. If you want multiple layers of ink on your panel, you'll want to heat set your ink between layers so you get some layering effect there. And also, some dye inks will lift with water, so you can try splattering water or spritzing water onto your panel and blotting with a paper towel to see what happens. I, of course, didn't have enough raspberry pink on my panel, so I cleared my palette. I just wiped it off with a wet paper towel, and I added some more pink and did another layer on my panel. And here is that completed card. It's hard to see, but I inlaid a couple of hearts into the base. The U die cut is from Impression Obsession, and the words are from a stamp set that I designed. One more ink pad watercolor technique, and stamp positioners make this technique so much easier than how we used to do it in the olden days. I'm just going to ink the pink areas of my stamps first, and I have a little bit of washi tape to mask off the stem. If you do use washi tape or any kind of tape to mask on your stamps when you're inking, make sure you take it off before you stamp. Ask me how I know. While that ink is fresh on the paper, I'm going to use a wet brush to fill in the image, and that's going to give me the base layer of my coloring. Different inks and different papers are going to have their own personalities. Some inks may lift completely and some may be a little more stubborn. So be sure to do a test run with the supplies that you have to see if you need to make any adjustments. If your ink is a little more stubborn or your paper is a little more stubborn, you might want to mist your stamp with a little water before you press it to the paper. Anyway, just get to know your supplies and how they work best for you. If you have a palette ready with ink, you could even do the wet into wet technique right away to add more depth to your coloring, but I decided to go ahead and finish my stamping first and then do my shading later. My color palette for this card is just 2 ink colors, but since these are opposite or complementary colors, I can mix them together to create some intermediate colors as well, and you'll see me do that in a little bit. I filled up my brush with a lot of watery paint to splatter the background and portions of my desk. I just knock the brush against the side of my finger to do the splattering, and that seems to work pretty well for me. Now I'm using a medium concentration of ink to add some shading to my flowers. And then I'll add green to my leaves, and I pulled off a little pink and green to mix together into a brown, and that will add a little more dimension and color to those leaves as well. I added some more loose coloring to the background, and then with a drier brush, I'm taking some concentrated ink to fill in the flower centers, and that's it. On my completed card, I embossed a sentiment, and all these stamps are from Impression Obsession. I hope this gives you ideas for stretching your dye ink pads using watercolor techniques, and I thank you so much for watching.